It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. Americans have just gone through one of the most difficult and conflicted presidential campaigns in modern times. The election played out against a paradoxical backdrop. Even with the economy steadily improving, unemployment at historic lows, hundreds of thousands of new jobs, the approval of President Barack Obama growing stronger and stronger, it is nonetheless a time of bitter partisanship and wide anxiety. We are in a moment of American history that is deeply skeptical of government and our political leadership. Polls show that we have deep doubts about our fellow citizens, too, especially when their political loyalties differ from our own. We are suspicious of each other. Many have lost confidence in fundamental ideals, such as permitting the members of any faith to freely worship. We are anxious about new forms of attack from foreign foes, even as we consistently meet those threats and punish our enemies. There is civil unrest on the streets, more tension between civilians and the police, and an unpopular war drags on far away. That is a description of 2016, but it carries some loud echoes of another time, at the end of the tumultuous 1960s, when a political figure with a complicated past won the presidency in the midst of great turmoil. The new president in 1969 was Richard Nixon, a man in whom we can see, in hindsight, a combination of some of the perplexing dimensions of both presidential candidates in 2016. He was already a longtime figure on the national stage and a political expert, an insider, not unlike Hillary Clinton. And like Clinton, Nixon also carried deep political scars and negative associations and habits. Nixon was also, we would eventually learn, an emotionally erratic and unstable man, consumed with grudges, willing to leverage the most base instincts of voters to gain power in ways sometimes reminiscent of Donald Trump's most troubling dimensions. So for this episode, we've asked a distinguished historian of the presidency and of Richard Nixon to join us in an examination of that time and that new president and what it might tell us about the challenges confronted by our country and our new president in the aftermath of this unpleasant election season. Tim Naftali is a former director of the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum and now clinical associate professor of history and public service at New York University and a regular CNN contributor on presidential history. He is the author of many articles and books on national security, intelligence, and presidential history, some of which he wrote while a senior scholar here at the Miller Center a decade ago. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure, Doug. It's nice to be back.
Now, Tim, we taped this discussion that we're about to have, we taped it before the election, the outcome of the election was actually known. And so we're going to have a conversation about, that is mostly about the parallels between that time and this time, and but also looking at ways in which the Nixon presidency, Nixon himself, the first year of his presidency, how all of those things relate to the time we live in today, but also the two candidates, one of whom is now on his or her way to becoming president of the United States.
I remember the discussion just before the Republican convention. And the Trump team then, it would change after the convention, but the Trump team then talked about how the inspiration for Trump's address would be Nixon, and that 68 was in many ways an organizing principle in 2016. Now, some of that could be explained because a number of Trump's advisors were old enough to have served Richard Nixon and to have participated in shaping Richard Nixon's public relations. But it also was a reflection of the sense among many angry voters in this country, on the left and on the right, that there was a fraying of the basic fabric of this country. There was a sense that government was either too much in your business or whatever it was doing was not successful. There was a sense that a common understanding of the threat to this nation both domestic and foreign, didn't exist. A sense that consensus, and one of the things we historians do all the time is tell you, you know what, there never really was the consensus people think, but there were shared principles and values. That all of that had gone, and there was in its place a sense of resentment, anger, and concern. And the Trump appeal was that I will calm these waters. And that's exactly what Richard Nixon said in 1968. He was offering not a vision, really, of the future. It was, this country's in trouble. It needs a strong leader. I have shown my strength. In the case of Nixon, it had been as a vice president. I can do this, and you need a law and order president. Now, the fact that there was an appeal that had, that had broad, there was certainly some broad appeal, was a product of the similarities between the late 60s and our current era. We always have to be very careful, Doug, about drawing analogies because there are personalities are different, issues are different.
They're always variables,
but there is no question that people in the United States that feel that something is terribly wrong. And after 15 years of fighting a faceless enemy, there is also a natural weakening of trust in government. Why haven't you fixed this problem? Why are we still fighting? Why are we actually threatened in our own neighborhoods? Couldn't we be doing a better job? That has created the kind of pressure on government for better results that this country was feeling in 68. Now, in 68, it wasn't a faceless enemy. The combat was different. The threat to Americans at home was not quite clear. Yes, you had a nuclear threat. It was a generalized one. But the Soviets were not considered that threatening, and they were the ones who'd launch a nuclear strike. But there was a sense that, our government keeps telling us that they're going to solve this problem. And yet, year after year, people die. What's going wrong? And what happens in the late 60s, and this is another parallel to today, is that this kind of conversation is happening on both sides of the spectrum, both sides of the aisle. It's not just among the right or Republicans. The left, too, has a sense of anger and disappointment. And as a result, you had the Bernie Sanders movement. That was a product of a disquiet on the left. So it's this moment of turbulence, which, though not exactly like 1968, is pushing to the fore at least one candidate who's just focusing on law and order.
So the sense of unsettlement that is occurring across the spectrum in this period of time, 67, 8, 69, as Nixon becomes president, produces this president who reflects in interesting ways and in different ways both of the figures that campaigned that were nominated for president in 2016. On the one hand, he is this longtime political figure. He's been around a long time. He's been in the White House as vice president, in the same way that Hillary Clinton had been in the White House in a sense as first lady. He is knowledgeable about the areas he's been involved with in government. He's very interested in foreign policy in particular, and he talks a very good talk, but he's also bears grudges, highly secretive, has scandals in the past that won't quite go away. Are there parallels between that version of Nixon and Hillary Clinton that tell us anything?
There are some parallels. One of the big differences is that Richard Nixon couldn't control his own id. He had a chip on his shoulder, even when he was, as he would say, at the highest mountaintop. The similarity between these two candidates is that Hillary Clinton bears a grudge, but it's not a grudge against lots of people. Richard Nixon didn't like Jews, and he didn't like gays, and he didn't like African Americans, and I remember talking to one of his closest advisors, Leonard Garment, and Leonard Garment happened to be Jewish, and I was asking about the anti-Semitism, and he said, well, to me, if you had to understand, he just hated everybody. Hillary Clinton bears, I believe, I don't know her, but I believe, just watching her and listening to her, that she bears the scars of Whitewater.
And everything
associated with it. And there are many different ways to deal with that, and of course, none of us has lived under that kind of microscope. She really doesn't like the press. And I say that because I watched during the campaign how little she interacts with the press. Her email scandal is actually understandable only, I believe, as a product of the sense that official Washington will leak her private information because everybody cares about the Clintons' private life. And rather than trust the State Department's archivists, who are real pros, and trust the system, she grabbed her information so that she would determine, or her lawyer would determine what was private and what was official. That's a product of the 90s. That's a product of Ken Starr and the special prosecutor. That's a product of the conspiracy theories that she'd killed her friend Vince Foster. That's a product of the travel gate. I mean, my goodness, the number of things that had the Nixonian gate associated with it in the first years of the Clinton administration were unbelievable. We've forgotten most of them. Mm-hmm. She hasn't. And it's that which I think makes her secretive.
No, that is a really remarkable observation to make, and also all the more remarkable in the sense that with the email scandal for Hillary Clinton, that unlike the Nixon secrecy scandals, but with Clinton, in the end, there's no there in terms of emails that finally surface and that appear to demonstrate high crimes or really serious offenses. And so, ironically, it is that in the case of Clinton, it's entirely the sense of cover-up that is the problem, not really the substance of the emails themselves. At least with Nixon, there was something that there was a need to cover up for his political viability.
To be fair-minded about this, emails were deleted, and we haven't found them, and we don't know. I'm not suggesting.
There may be.
But what I know for a fact, okay, what I feel confident. I don't know for a fact because I haven't seen these deleted emails. I know that the thing that drove the congressional inquiry, that led to the demand for the emails, the Benghazi matter, that I am sure is not touched on by the emails that she deleted. I have a feeling. Clinton Foundation matters, personal matters about relationship with her husband. I suspect those are the things that are gone. I'm not suggesting that those would lead to articles of impeachment. No, but we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
But as regards Benghazi, given the nature of that whole inquiry, I would be surprised if her lawyer deleted things related to Benghazi that would have resulted in impeachment. I don't even know what the issue would have been.
And so now let's talk about Nixon and Trump. And I think these are, one might say, an alignment of even more troubling aspects of both men. But yeah, what is beyond the circumstantial, the situational similarity between Trump and Nixon in terms of the men and what seems to be the character and their instincts of them as individuals? How do they align?
Well, Donald Trump tweets what Richard Nixon would say to his inner circle. The uncontrolled id, the prejudice, the biases, the immature egotism, the sense of the defensiveness, the thin-skinned nature of Donald Trump's social media persona, that was Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, captured on tape. And the real interesting question for us is when a thin-skinned person who seems troubled becomes president, how well does the system accommodate for that and protect us from this person's impulses? That's the key question. And obviously, given that Richard Nixon is the only president to have resigned, and he would have been found guilty if he had not been pardoned. Obviously, the Nixon system didn't work very well. I mean, he got reelected, but he got reelected because the public didn't know what was going on in the White House, and despite his best efforts to hold that in, eventually it got to him. So the system has a limit. And beyond which it can't protect you. But I think without the tapes, without the fact that Richard Nixon was so thin-skinned, and was in such a competition with Henry Kissinger, and that's why he taped, because he wanted to be able to leak to the press that he was the originator of all these great ideas in foreign policy. If it had not been for that, I think in a struggle between the president and his opponents, the American people will tend to side with the president when it's a matter of impeachment, not when it's a matter of approving them. Richard Nixon never would have resigned, I'm convinced, had it not been for the tapes. And that means the system might not have worked, that he might have actually finished his second term and then enjoyed the accolades that former presidents enjoyed, which means that the system would have learned that you can abuse power without consequence. So I think we were very fortunate that there were tapes, which of course has there's a consequence of this kind of thinking, which is that have we learned enough since the 70s so that in case of having a president who is impulsive, who is thin-skinned, who will order things that are not in his interest, let alone that of the country, that the system will push back and protect us from him? It's not clear that that will happen. Now, that's a real worry to me. There are checks and balances. They're not perfect. And the White House is structured to insulate the president and protect him or her. And I think there are challenges there.
It is interesting in that had there not been the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, then even if that had not been discovered, if they'd gotten in and gotten out, then none of these things likely would have ever been known, with or without tapes. Had there not been tapes, we wouldn't have gotten to the final resolution of connecting the president to it or having a strong confidence of that. Had there not been Benghazi, we would never have learned about the emails. Right. And if there had been some troubling thing in Hillary Clinton's emails, the question would have never been raised. And we know that because the somewhat similar system that that Secretary Colin Powell had, we never heard about until we heard about the one that Hillary Clinton had.
But a president should always assume there's always going to be a Benghazi. Yeah. I mean, if it hadn't been for Monica Lewinsky.
Right.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's very... these things are just going to happen. You have to, and that's why you shouldn't do bad things. Yeah. I mean, you shouldn't do it for moral reasons. But if you want to be purely cynical about it, don't do it because chances are something's going to happen that you hadn't anticipated. But the untold story really is the role that Republicans played in trying to harness and rein in Richard Nixon. The heroes, not just there were civil servants, but also political appointees, who said this man is going too far. The people in the IRS, who said no to this man when he wanted to audit, the famous enemies list. That was Nixon's idea. Don't ever think that it came from somebody else. It came from Nixon. The investigations that didn't happen, the wiretapping that didn't happen. Richard Nixon at one point wanted a list of every single Jewish American in the United States government. And he wanted a non-Jewish person to be placed over them. And he said to Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, he said, Jews cannot be trusted. They're disloyal. They're basically disloyal. Well, Haldeman did a little of this, which is to his eternal, I think that's one of the number of bad things that he did. He also found a man named Fred Malek who was willing to put together a list of Jews for the president. But the fact that you have a president that's ordering things that are absolutely illegal, unethical, and a disgrace to the Constitution. Fortunately, in the Nixon period, not everything he asked for he got.
Well, that is a very important observation, particularly given that in this campaign that we just had, depending on one's political spectrum, where you were on the spectrum, there were people who viewed both candidates in these apocalyptic dimensions, this view that if Hillary Clinton were to become president, this parade of terror and horrible decisions would flow from that, and even worse depictions from the most partisan folks against Donald Trump. The idea is somewhat reassuring to hear that even with all of your misgivings and concerns about the system, that in the end, good human character and even people who were allied with President Nixon in terms of pure politics did the right thing.
Yes, the one difference, though, I mean, yes, and that's something to be remembered, and that when people look at how our government reacted to Nixon, it's not just a story about the Democrats, and it's not just a story about the press, although they're both very important. It's also a story about American patriots, Republican patriots who said no. What we don't know, and even when this appears, if Donald Trump is elected, we still won't know the answer to this, is the Republican Party has been split by the Trump campaign. The whole Trump phenomenon has developed a fissure in the party. Many of the most experienced, the most thoughtful Republican leaders won't work for Trump. So it's not clear what kind of people he will recruit. Nixon was a well-known figure. He was actually viewed much more moderate. He was viewed as a moderate when he really wasn't. A lot of great Republican administrators joined the Nixon team.
George Romney.
We don't know.
Right.
And perhaps we'll know a little more later, but if we're Trump elected, who's going to, besides Christie and Giuliani and Sessions and General Flynn, who's going to participate in this enterprise? It's not clear that the people that will come into a Trump administration will have the character, will know enough about America and its government to say no. You need an enormous amount of self-confidence as a sub-cabinet or cabinet official to say no to your president.
After the inauguration, President Trump calls up Tim Naftali and says, I heard you on CNN one night saying that I'm Nixonian, or making some comparison between me and Richard Nixon. What do I need to listen to? What do I need to do, particularly in these first months, this first year of the presidency, where you'll end up not viewing me as a Nixonian figure, or you'll have some belief that I could succeed?
Well, that's a really tough and interesting question. It's a tough question. You see, this is the problem when you have somebody running and they are not promising any detailed approach. You don't actually know what they believe in. You just don't know. You don't know whether, with power, this person will start implementing horrible things that are reflected in the tweets. The advice I would give, this is not going to happen, but the advice that I would give Mr. Trump, then if he's President Trump, is, sir, please be a more thoughtful, deliberate leader than your tweets suggest. I would say to Mr. Trump, our system, our beautiful constitutional system, is fragile. Our forefathers set up checks and balances, but they had George Washington in mind, and they gave the President of the United States an awesome collection of responsibilities that are unmatched by any democratically elected person in the world today. He is commander-in-chief, he is head of government, he is head of state. Your advisors are always going to disagree, which means you're going to have to make the decision. When you make that decision, a whole part of the US government is going to start marching in a certain direction. This is not like running a business. And be more deliberate. And if it means changing the way you make decisions, and I know you pride yourself on a career of successes, do it. This is not the same as any experience you've ever had in your professional life. He's not going to listen to that, and that's really hard advice to somebody who's just beaten the odds and become president. But that is the issue here, which is that the presidency is something you cannot prepare for completely, but you can put yourself in the right mindset. And that mindset is a bit more modest, a little bit more awestruck than so far we have seen in the way in which, in the language that Mr. Trump uses.
Tim Naftali, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Doug.
And we thank our viewers for being here too. American Forum now broadcasts coast to coast, east to west, north to south on hundreds of PBS television stations, the World Channel, Facebook Live, and across the internet. We're nonpartisan and we're pro-democracy. And we believe that no matter how much Americans may sometimes disagree, if we keep talking to each other and looking for the wisdom in our shared history, we'll be okay. If you'd like to send us a comment or join our conversation, go to the Miller Center Facebook page or follow us on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. You can reach today's guest @Tim Naftali. To watch other episodes of American Forum, share them with your friends, join our email list, or read a transcript of this dialogue, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you again next week.